Daniel was standing near the window with a cup of coffee gone half cold in his hand, his wounded arm held carefully against his side, when Charlie wandered over and stood beside him, chin tilted up. "Does it hurt?" the boy asked, nodding at the bandage visible beneath Daniel's shirt. "Only if I forget it's there." "Why were you bleeding so much?" Daniel looked down at him for a moment. "That's a long story. Not a very good one." Charlie seemed to accept that the way children accept most things adults won't explain, with a small shrug, and he was about to ask something else when Daniel's whole body went still. Through the gap in the curtain, far off on the ridge road, 3 riders were coming on at a steady pace. Daniel set the cup down without a sound and pulled the curtain shut with 2 fingers. "Abby?" She came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped when she saw his face. "They're coming," he said. "The sheriff, 2 others with him." Her hand went still against the cloth. "So, what's wrong with that?" "They're looking for me." The words landed on her slower than he expected, her face working its way through them. "If they ask you anything at all, no strangers come through here. No one. You understand?" Abby's mouth opened, then closed. When she finally spoke, her voice came out thin, stumbling over itself. Is that who shot you?" "Not them. Same trouble, though." "Please," she said, and her voice shook on it. "Don't hurt us." "I'm not going to hurt you." Daniel said it fast, like he needed her to hear it before anything else. "I don't want anything from you but your silence. A few more days, till I can travel, and then I'm gone. You'll never see me again. I swear it." It wasn't much of a promise to hang a family's safety on. He knew that. She knew it too, and he watched her decide, in the space of a breath, to believe him anyway, because there wasn't time left to decide anything else. "Charlie comes with me," Daniel said, already moving toward the boy. Abby's whole body turned toward her son. "No." "I won't hurt him. I won't so much as raise my voice to him. But if they search the house and find him alone in a back room, a boy his age won't hold a straight face for a lawman. You will. Better he's with me, out of sight, where nobody has to lie in front of him." It was reason dressed up as comfort, and both of them knew which one it really was. But there was no time left to argue it, and some small, terrible part of Abby understood the logic even as she hated it. Daniel crouched to Charlie's level, hand light on his shoulder. "I need you to come sit with me in the back room for a little while. Can you do that?" Charlie looked to his mother. Abby, throat tight, nodded once. "I'm not going to do anything to you," Daniel said, quiet, steady, meeting the boy's eyes and holding them. "Not one thing. I just need you to be quiet and stay close to me till they're gone. Then you can go straight back to your mother." Charlie studied him the way children study adults when they're deciding whether to be afraid, searching for the wrong kind of stillness in a person's face, and didn't find it. He nodded and let Daniel lead him toward the back room without another word. The last thing Daniel saw before the door closed behind them was Abby, standing in the middle of her own kitchen, smoothing her apron flat with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, getting ready to lie to the law for a man she'd known 3 days. Outside, hooves slowed on the hard-packed yard, boots on the porch steps. "Afternoon, Mrs. Renner." "Afternoon, Sheriff." Through the wall, the words came thin and half-swallowed, but Daniel caught enough. A killing over in Clay County, a man shot and running, had she seen anyone. Beside him, Charlie sat with his knees drawn up, watching Daniel's face instead of the wall. Daniel didn't reach for him again, just kept his own breathing slow and even, deliberately, so there'd be something steady in the room for the boy to borrow if he needed it. "No one's come by," Abby's voice, muffled but steady. "Just me and my boy out here." A pause. Daniel counted his own heartbeat in it. "You'd tell me if someone had." "I'd have no reason not to, Sheriff." Boots moved on the porch boards. A second voice, younger, a deputy, asking something Daniel couldn't make out. Abby's answer came quick enough not to sound rehearsed. Something about the boy being sick a few days back, keeping her busy, no time for company even if any had come. Charlie's hand found a fold of Daniel's shirt and held on. Daniel didn't tell him to let go. A long stretch of nothing. Then, leather creaking, a horse shifting its weight, the unhurried sound of men deciding there was nothing here worth pressing. "We'll let you get back to it. You see anybody, send word to town." "I will." Hooves on dirt, then grass, then the particular hush of riders shrinking into open country until there was nothing left of them at all. Daniel let his breath out slow. Charlie was still holding his shirt. "They're gone," Daniel said. "You did fine." The boy let go and looked up at him, solemn in a way that didn't belong on a 9-year-old's face. "Are you going to hurt my mom?" "No," Daniel said. "I'm not." "Then why'd we have to hide?" Daniel didn't have a good answer for that, not one a boy that age could carry. So he said the only true thing he had. "Because I did something wrong a while back, and I'm not ready yet for what happens when people find out." Charlie considered that with the same plain seriousness he seemed to bring to everything, and didn't ask more. When Daniel opened the door, Abby was standing exactly where he'd left her, hands still pressed flat against her apron. She looked at Charlie first, checking him over the way mothers do without meaning to, and then at Daniel, and whatever was in her face wasn't relief. It was something colder and more complicated than that. "You didn't have to take him," she said. "I know." Daniel meant it. "I'm sorry I did." She didn't answer. She only reached for Charlie's hand and drew him against her side, and stood there a long moment in her own kitchen, looking at the stranger she had just lied to a lawman for, understanding, in a way she hadn't fully let herself understand until now, exactly what kind of trouble she'd let inside her door. Why was Daniel bleeding badly enough that a 9-year-old noticed it before anyone else did? Why did the sight of the sheriff send him into hiding and pull a woman he'd known only 3 days into lying to protect him? What is really between him and Abby Renner, and where does it end for either of them? If this is your first time here, welcome to Wild West Life. On this channel, nobody gets rescued from what they've done. There are no easy endings. Only the people who stay long enough to find out what holds and what doesn't. If that's the kind of story you're looking for, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and leave a comment telling us where you think this one ends. He'd been running since the shot took him in the shoulder, distance in the dark doing more to save him than the wound had any right to allow. He didn't remember most of it, a blur of fence lines and creek beds and his own ragged breathing. Only that at some point the running had turned into walking, and the walking into something closer to falling, one step dragged after another through open country he didn't know. By the time the ranch's fence line rose up out of the night, he could no longer tell which he was doing. He went down at the gate. The sound of it, boot heel catching a post, the full weight of him hitting packed dirt, was enough to bring a woman out onto the porch with a lamp raised high against the dark. She didn't come closer at first. A stranger bleeding in her yard at night was reason enough to bar the door and wait for morning. And for a long, stunned moment, she seemed to be weighing exactly that. Then the boy was beside her, tugging at her sleeve, saying, "He's going to die out there, Mama." And something in her decided before the rest of her had finished arguing about it. She and the boy worked by lamplight, cutting the shirt away, packing the wound, binding it off with strips torn from a flour sack towel. Her hands quick and unpracticed and steady anyway. Neither of them said much while they worked. Fear doesn't leave room for conversation, and there was plenty of it in that kitchen, hers at what she'd just let through her door, his, distantly, at how close the dark had come to keeping him. The fever came on hard before the next dawn. Daniel drifted through rooms that weren't there, and voices that might not have been either. Somewhere in the haze, he was aware of a cool cloth pressed to his forehead, of being made to swallow water he didn't want, of a boy's voice asking his mother, in a whisper clearly not meant to carry, whether the man was going to die after all. Through the worst of it, Charlie kept his distance, but not his curiosity, hovering in doorways, fetching water without being asked, watching the stranger's face for the moment it would either settle or stop moving altogether. Once, when Abby's hands shook too badly to manage the dressing, It was Charlie who held the lamp steady and didn't look away. By the second evening, the fever still hadn't broken, and Abby had stopped asking herself whether she'd made a mistake pulling him inside. There was no decision left to make by then, only the wound, the little medicine she had on hand, and the waiting, which she did at his bedside in the hard chair from the kitchen, more nights than she would later admit to anyone. It turned before sunrise on the third day. Daniel woke with his mind clear for the first time in 2 days, dry-mouthed, hollowed out, looking up at a woman he didn't know, in a house he had no right to be in. "You're awake," she said, like she hadn't quite let herself believe it would happen. "You should have left me at the gate." Maybe. She didn't sound like she agreed. Wasn't going to, though. Neither of them asked the questions that mattered. Who he was, what he'd done, why someone was hunting him hard enough to put a bullet in his shoulder. There would be time for that, or there wouldn't. For now, there was only the small, careful business of a stranger learning to trust the hands that had kept him alive, and a woman learning to live with a decision she couldn't yet explain to herself, even lying awake with it at 3 in the morning. By mid-morning, he could stand long enough to hold a cup of coffee at the window without his legs betraying him, and the boy, recovered from his fright faster than either adult had, the way children so often do, had already decided he wasn't afraid to ask a stranger questions a boy his age had no business asking. That was the morning the riders came. The days after the sheriff's visit were quiet in a way that felt earned rather than restful. Abby didn't raise the subject of Charlie in the back room again, and Daniel didn't ask her to forgive him for it. He simply set about making himself smaller trouble than he'd been that first week, and it turned out the surest way he knew to do that was work. He started small, the second morning after the fever broke for good, carrying water he hadn't been asked to carry, splitting kindling with his good arm while the other stayed bound tight against his ribs, mending a hinge on the chicken coop that had been squealing since before he arrived. Abby told him twice to sit down and rest. He thanked her both times and kept working. "You don't owe me a house full of repairs," she said, the third time she caught him at it, arms crossed in the doorway. "I know." He didn't stop. "I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because I can't sit in a chair all day being looked after by people I put in danger." That she didn't have an answer for. By the second week, well enough now to trust his own weight, he turned his attention to the corral, a job he'd noticed the first morning he could stand at the window. 3 rails down on the north side, where a young horse had put its shoulder through them once too often. He picked a clear morning and started without asking permission, working alone through the first hour before Charlie wandered out to watch. It didn't go well at first. The ground on that side of the yard sat low, and years of runoff had turned it soft under a crust that looked solid enough until a man's full weight came down on it. His first post went in crooked, leaning like a drunk before he'd even tamped the earth around it. He pulled it, tried again, a foot to the left where the ground held firmer, and got it standing true. The rail was the real mistake. He'd set the new one against the old post, tested it with a shove that felt reasonable enough, and it gave, all at once, the whole thing swinging loose and dropping him hard onto his bad shoulder in the dirt. Charlie's face went white. Daniel lay there a moment, breathing through it, more embarrassed than hurt, and then started laughing, low and short, at the absurdity of surviving a bullet only to be undone by a fence rail. "You're bleeding again," Charlie said, pointing. He was. A thin line of red had come through the shirt where the fall had torn something loose beneath the bandage. He pressed a hand to it, sat with his back against a post until the dizziness passed, and looked at what he'd built. "Rail was rotted through the middle," he said finally. "Should have checked it before I trusted my weight to it. Lesson in that, if you're paying attention." "What lesson?" "Don't lean on something just because it looks like it'll hold." He didn't finish the corral that day. It took the better part of 2 more weeks, done in short stretches whenever his strength allowed, testing every rail before he trusted it, learning the give of the soft ground and working around it instead of against it. until the day it finally stood square and solid enough that Abby, walking past with a bucket, stopped to lean her whole weight on the top rail without thinking twice about it. She caught herself doing it and looked at him. "Holds," she said, like she was surprised to admit it out loud. Ought to. Took it seriously the second time. By then, Charlie had made himself part of the work without either adult deciding to let him, handing up nails, holding a rail steady while Daniel checked it, and eventually testing each new one himself with a shove of his own before Daniel would trust it. Daniel let him. A boy who learned to distrust a thing that only looked solid was a boy who'd save himself some hard falls later on. And he said as much, once, without making it sound like praise. The baking started almost by accident, on an evening when Abby was too tired to do more than stare at a bowl of stiff, unrisen dough and admit defeat. Daniel had watched her work it twice already and said nothing, until the third night, when he finally told her the flour was heavier than she thought it was, and she was working it like she was still angry at it. "I'm not teaching you a recipe," he told her when she asked him to write one down. "A recipe's no good to you if the oven runs different tomorrow than it did today. I'm teaching you to feel when it's right." It took her the better part of 3 weeks to learn what he meant. Her first loaf under his instruction came out dense enough to prop a door with. The second scorched black on the outside, while the inside stayed pale and raw, because she'd trusted the oven's heat instead of watching the color climb the crust the way he'd told her to. A starter he helped her build went sour and had to be thrown out and begun again. She swore, more than once, in language Daniel pretended not to notice, and kept trying anyway. The scorched loaf became something of a joke between them, in the careful way new jokes are, tested gently to see if it would hold. "Could have used it to shingle the roof," Daniel said, turning the blackened thing over in his hands. Abby, flour to her elbows, threw a dish towel at him without much force behind it, and neither of them said anything else, but the kitchen felt lighter for the rest of that evening than it had in days. By the fourth week, there was a loaf that came out right, crust dark and even, crumbs soft all the way through, and she stood over it in the kitchen for a long moment before she let herself smile, the way a person smiles at something they've earned rather than something they've been given. "Where'd you learn to teach it like that?" she asked. "Not the baking, the watching." "My mother." He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask for it. She used to say the oven would tell you everything if you were willing to listen instead of guess. It was the first true thing about his life before Clay County that he'd given her, small as it was, and they both seemed to understand it as exactly that, a door left open an inch, not thrown wide. Evenings, when the work was done, and Charlie's energy for the day had finally worn thin, Daniel took to the porch with his knife and a block of soft cottonwood, and Charlie took to sitting beside him, close enough to watch but not quite close enough to be in the way. Neither of them talked much while he worked. The shape came slow, a horse, legs planted, head low as if grazing, and Charlie watched every cut with the particular patience of a boy who has decided something is worth watching. Abby watched too, some evenings, from just inside the doorway where she thought neither of them could see her. Daniel saw her anyway, more than once, and said nothing about it, the way she said nothing about the mended porch step, or the tightened hinge on her bedroom door, or the small, unasked-for repairs that kept turning up around the house, like something was quietly paying down a debt, one nail at a time. Some nights, once Charlie had finally gone down and the house had gone quiet around them, Abby brought her mending out to the porch instead of doing it alone at the kitchen table, and Daniel didn't ask why, and she didn't explain it. They sat within arm's reach of each other in the dark more often than either of them would have admitted to out loud, her needle moving through a torn cuff, his knife moving through cottonwood, the two sounds keeping a kind of time together. Once, reaching past him for the lamp, her hand brushed his, and neither of them pulled away as fast as either of them would have a month before. Neither of them said anything about that either. There wasn't a word yet that fit what was happening between them, and some things, Daniel had come to think, were better left unnamed until a person had earned the right to name them. It was on one of those evenings, mending forgotten in her lap, that Abby told him about Walt. She hadn't married expecting trouble, she said. She'd been 20 when she said yes to him, 21 when Charlie came, and it had taken the better part of the years since to understand that some men were never going to be any steadier than the last card in their hand. Walt had a talent for looking sure of himself, even flat broke, and a longer talent for believing the next hand would fix what the last dozen hadn't. The ranch had come close to going under twice before he finally left it for good. Not over a debt this time, but for a woman 2 towns over who hadn't yet learned what Abby had learned the hard way. "He didn't leave because we ran out of money," she said. "We ran out of money because of him." He left because staying meant looking at what he'd done to us every day, and he never had the stomach to look at himself that long. She said it plainly, without much heat left in it. The particular plainness that only comes after a person has told a story to herself so many times in the dark that it's finally worn smooth. Daniel didn't offer sympathy he didn't think she wanted. "How old were you when you married him?" 20. Felt older at the time. Feels younger every year I look back on it. "And Charlie?" "I was 21. She glanced toward the house, where the boy had long since fallen asleep.
9 years old now. I've run this place alone longer than Walt and I ever ran it together."
Daniel didn't say what he was thinking, that a woman who'd raised a boy alone on land hard enough to break a grown man twice her size was not someone who needed rescuing by anybody, least of all him. He only nodded and let the quiet hold what neither of them seemed to want to fill with anything more. It was in the 5th week, with the wooden horse nearly finished and Daniel's strength nearly returned, that Charlie broke the hatchet. He'd been told not to use it alone, and used it alone anyway, trying to split kindling the way he'd watched Daniel do it, and the head came loose from a handle already cracked, flew wide, and buried itself in the dirt a foot from his boot. No one was hurt. That didn't matter to Abby, who came out at the sound of it, white-faced and furious in the particular way only fear dressed up as anger can be. "You know better," she said. "You know you're not to touch that without one of us there." "I wanted to help." "That's not an answer, Charlie." She told him there'd be no reading before bed for a week and extra chores besides, and Daniel, watching the boy's face fall, opened his mouth to say it wasn't all his doing, that a cracked handle was as much to blame as a 9-year-old's impatience. Charlie cut him off before he got past the first word. "I broke it," he said. "I have to make it right." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, and took the week's punishment without another word of protest, walking off toward the woodpile to start the extra chores before his mother had even finished explaining them. Abby went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the hatchet. She looked at her son's back as he walked away and then, for one unguarded moment, at Daniel. And whatever passed between them in that look, neither of them said it out loud. Daniel didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark, turning the boy's words over. The plainness of them, the ease with which a child had reached for something Daniel had spent every day since that night in Clay County running from. Somewhere near the edge of sleep, the fragments came anyway, the way they always did when he let his guard down. Raised voices in a kitchen that wasn't this one, his own hand moving before thought had caught up to it. The shove, the fall, and then the particular silence that comes after. The kind that tells you before your mind is ready to know it, that nothing that happens next will undo what already has. He didn't sleep the rest of that night, and somewhere in the dark, turning it over, he understood, not for the first time, but for the first time without looking away from it, that running from Clay County hadn't spared him anything. It had only handed the weight of it to people who'd never asked to carry it. The second visit came 3 weeks after the first and gave him almost no warning at all. He caught sight of them through the kitchen window, the sheriff and 2 deputies, already at the fence line, closing fast on horses pushed harder than a routine round of questions called for. There was no time to reach the cellar. There was barely time to think. And some part of him, watching them come, understood that he didn't want to hide this time. "Abby." His voice came out steadier than he expected, given what he was about to ask of her. "They're here for good, this time. I can feel it. I'm not running from this one." She went very still. "What are you saying?" I'm saying it ends today. But when they find you and Charlie, it has to look like you never had a choice in any of it. Not the hiding, not the lying, none of it. I need to tie you both up before they reach the door. Her stillness broke. No. Abby, there's no time. No, I won't be part of dressing you up as some kind of monster so I come out clean of this. I chose to help you. I'll live with what that cost me. You have a son. That landed the way he'd meant it to, and he hated himself a little for using it, and said it anyway. I've already handed him more of this danger than I had any right to. I won't walk out that door knowing I could have taken some of it back and chose not to. She didn't say yes. She never said yes, not once. The whole time he worked the rope, soft cord from the mending basket, wound loose enough not to mark her wrists, tied to the leg of the kitchen table where she could sit rather than kneel. She simply stopped fighting him on it, which was not the same thing, and both of them understood the difference even if neither said so out loud. Charlie surprised them both. When Daniel crouched down to explain it to him, hooves already audible in the yard, the boy considered it with the same plain seriousness he brought to everything and said, "It's like the hatchet, isn't it? You did something wrong. You have to make it right." Something like that. Okay. He held out his wrist without being asked. Don't make it too tight. Daniel's hands were not steady doing it, though the boy's were. You could still run, Abby said, rope loose around wrists she hadn't once tried to work free, the sound of riders now unmistakable outside. Out the back, there might still be time. I know. He didn't move toward the back door. He crossed the kitchen instead and kissed her, once, unhurried, despite everything closing in around them. The way a man kisses something he doesn't expect to be given again. She let him. Neither of them pretended it was anything other than what it was. Take care of your mother, he told Charlie. Then he walked out the front door with both hands raised to meet the sheriff in his own yard. The sheriff pulled up short at the sight of a man standing there, in plain view, unarmed, hands already in the air. And it took a long moment for the surprise to settle into something more familiar. I'm the man you've been looking for, Daniel said. Out of Clay County. I'm not going to give you any trouble. But the woman and her boy are inside, tied up, and they had no say in any of it. Not tonight, not any of the weeks before it. That's on me alone. See to them first, before you do anything else. It took the sheriff less than 5 minutes to confirm it for himself. He sent a deputy in to cut Abby and Charlie loose while he stood in the yard with his rifle, loosely trained on a man who'd already given up the only thing he had left to fight with. The trial was brief. In the sentence, 8 years at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing for manslaughter without malice, came down harder than a man who'd turned himself in might have hoped, and lighter than a man who'd run for as long as he had deserved. Daniel accepted it without appeal. He spent most of those 8 years underground, on the prison's coal detail, work that suited him better than idleness ever had, hard and repetitive, and blessedly short on time to think between one shovelful and the next. It was not so different some days from a corral rail he didn't trust yet. Something to test, something to get right on the second try if the first one failed. The letter started that first winter and never stopped. One told him the wooden horse had a permanent place on the shelf above Charlie's bed, and that the boy dusted it himself without being asked. One, a year or so later, mentioned that 2 women in town had started asking to buy bread by the loaf, and that Abby had said yes before she'd fully thought through what saying yes would mean. One noted, almost as an aside, that the corral had held through 2 hard winters without a single rail giving way, a fact Daniel read over more times than he'd admit to anyone. One, further on, was written in a hand that had changed enough that he had to check the signature to be sure it was still Charlie's. The last one before his release told him, plainly, that the bread had outgrown Abby's kitchen and that she'd taken a small storefront on the town's main street. Nothing grand, she wrote, but hers. He read every letter twice through and kept every one of them. He never once wrote back asking her to visit, and twice, when she asked to come see him herself, he sent word declining, because some part of him could not make peace with the idea of her spending a single visiting room hour of her life waiting on a man behind bars when she could be spending it building something of her own instead. 8 years, almost to the week, after he'd walked out of Abby's kitchen with his hands raised, Daniel walked out through the gates at Lansing with everything he owned in a canvas sack and no plan beyond the first few steps of open road. Charlie was waiting for him at the gate. Not the boy Daniel remembered, but a young man of 17, tall in a way that made Daniel feel every one of his own years, standing with his hat in his hands like he wasn't sure whether the moment called for formality or not. "You didn't have to come," Daniel said. "I wanted to." Charlie put his hat back on. "She's got a bakery in town now, Renner's, on Main Street. She still makes your bread, the one with the dark crust. Sells out most days before noon." He didn't say anything else. He didn't say his mother had waited, or that she still spoke of him, or what she might feel walking through that door after 8 years. He simply turned and started walking, and after a moment, Daniel followed. The walk into town took the better part of an afternoon. Neither of them said much. There didn't seem to be a way to fit 8 years into conversation without cheapening it, so they let the road do most of the talking instead. The same kind of quiet Daniel remembered from porch evenings a lifetime ago. Comfortable in a way silence rarely was between two people who had nothing left to prove to each other. Main Street was busier than Daniel had pictured it. Storefronts he didn't recognize standing where he remembered open field. He found the one Charlie pointed him toward without needing the sign to confirm it. The smell alone would have told him, warm and dark-crusted, drifting out onto the boardwalk. He stopped outside the window. Inside, Abby stood behind a counter, flour on her forearms, sliding a tray from an oven that wasn't the one he remembered teaching her on. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched her work for a moment, sure-handed now in a way she hadn't been that first winter, moving through a kitchen that was entirely her own, and understood, with the same plainness Charlie always seemed to carry things, that whatever she had built in the years he'd been gone, she had built it herself. He had only ever set the first stone. He'd stopped at a stand 2 streets back and bought the first bundle of flowers he'd seen, plain wildflowers, bound with twine, without fully deciding why until he was standing outside her window holding them. She straightened, reaching to wipe her hands on her apron, and happened to glance up through the glass. Her eyes found his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she was around the counter and through the door before he'd worked out what to do with his hands, and she was in his arms, the flowers crushed a little between them, and neither of them minding. "You're back," she said. "I am." He held her the way a man holds something he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to hold again. "I'm not running anymore." Before you go, ask yourself honestly, if you were Daniel, would you have had the nerve to walk into that jailhouse? To hand over whatever was left of your freedom, knowing it might be for good? Or would you have kept running, the way most of us probably would, telling yourself just a little longer, just until it felt safer? And what about Abby? A wounded stranger collapses at her gate in the middle of the night. She doesn't know his name. She doesn't know what he's done. Within days, he's asking her to lie to the law on his behalf, to put her own son's safety on the line for a man she's known less than a week. Would you have let him stay? Would you have trusted a stranger that much, that fast? There's no easy answer to either question. That's exactly the kind of story this was. Tell us in the comments, Daniel or Abby, whose decision would have been harder for you? And if this is the kind of story you're looking for, hit subscribe. There's a new one every day. And nobody here gets let off easy.